is that they have a clean power and electrification pathway project. And Gabriella Collins is here. She's the Senior Policy Manager for Governmental Affairs at Edison, and she's going to tell us about it. And we're very excited about it because we think that this hopefully will be the beginning of partnering with Edison on this kind of a thing.
Thank you, Jackie, and certainly we look forward to having many more conversations around this space. Again, Gabriella Collins of Southern California Edison. We applaud the work of the South Bay cities and are very proud to sponsor today's event. And I wanted to just take a minute to talk to you about our clean power and electrification pathway. We do have the document, the proposal available outside. If you haven't seen this yet, we can also get this to you electronically. So as I'm sure we can all agree, Southern California is one of the most desirable places to live. It also, as we know, has some of the worst air quality. Climate change is causing sea levels to rise and heat waves to become more intense. So how do we prevent climate change? This question is undeniably complicated, controversial even. But we do know that we all have to work together to solve it. If we want to take a stand against climate change, and improve our air quality, we have to stop depending on carbon. Cars and trucks, electricity, water heating, these have got to move away from using carbon. And California is a prime example of why. We have two of the nation's largest ports and heavy goods movement through the region. We depend on cars to get around. Buildings rely on natural gas and for heating. And unfortunately, this results in poor air quality. Asthma, hypertension, sleep deprivation, and cancer all have links to air pollution as a cause. So by driving home from work, we are literally making our neighbors sick. Fortunately, California has set goals to improve, and we have to make big steps by 2030. We have 12 years to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40%. Right now, we're about even with 1990 levels. We've done well to reduce emissions so far, but we still have a ways to go in 12 short years. The question is, how do we get there in a way that's affordable, sustainable, good for the economy, and good for our communities? We need new ideas, new partnerships, new infrastructure, and a whole lot of support from industries across the economy and from the government to find practical alternatives. We think electricity could be the game-changing, affordable alternative, and there's a practical reason why. We know that if we ever want to get to zero emissions, eventually, we have to replace many of the things we rely on today that require combustion. We took a close look at each economic sector to see which is contributing the most to greenhouse gas emissions, and to help us understand where we should focus to make the greatest impact at the lowest cost. The largest contributor today is transportation, followed by the electric sector. Industrial and commercial and residential sectors trail not too far behind. We can't go to any one of these sectors and say, hey, no more carbon for you, find another way. That would unfairly force that sector to pick up the costs, and it wouldn't be the most effective and economical way to create real change. But we can all work together. And this is how. A three-part integrated solution to tackle some of the largest emissions contributors. To meet California's state goals, changes need to take place in more than just the electric sector, because this sector has already done more than any other sector to reduce emissions. And even if it got to zero, we would miss the 40% emissions reduction goal by a long shot. The best solution is to combine improvements in the electric, transportation, and residential and commercial building sectors. We'll do our part to decarbonize the electric sector, and we can help these other two sectors electrify their industries and use our zero-emission electricity. For electric utilities, we can create an electric generation mix powered by at least 80% carbon-free resources. Then, anything that uses that energy down the line will also be clean. That means more solar, wind, hydropower, and other energy that has zero emissions, along with energy storage to help integrate it all. Right now, Southern California Edison delivers about 40% renewable energy. So we have to double that where we are now, and we believe that's doable. So closely tied to what we've been talking about today, vehicle electrification. That's another huge component of this pathway. With transportation accounting for 39% of emissions, the logical way to clean that sector is to transition to electric and plug into the 80% renewable generation. Essentially, use zero-emission generation to power zero-emission vehicles. By 2030, in California, we will need to put 7 million or more personal electric vehicles on the road, up from about 300,000 today. Medium and heavy-duty trucks will also need to go electric, which is crucial because trucks disproportionately affect our air quality, especially along freight corridors, such as the 710 freeway leaving the ports. The auto industry is already seeing that electric is the future. Mercedes, Volvo, GM, Volkswagen, and Jaguar have each committed to either electrify their entire fleet or add hybrid options to all their models, to every model. We're also seeing cities create new policies to reduce gas-powered vehicles and take an active role in the transformation of the transportation sector, as evidenced by the efforts happening here in the South Bay. As cities are setting goals for reducing energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, facilitating electric vehicle deployment is becoming a vital tool to achieve energy and sustainability goals. Leading electric vehicle cities have shown that as a result of dedicated local policies complementing state policy, they can create a favorable environment for electric vehicle use and reduce consumer barriers. 7 million electric vehicles will require us all to think about where we place charging stations. We need to make it easy to charge, and we need support from many industries to make this happen. They need to be at homes, gas stations, apartment complexes, workplaces. The good news is we're seeing other industries jump in to make this happen. BP is talking with automakers to install chargers at their gas stations, and Shell is already installing chargers at their sites across Europe. By increasing the number of charging stations, we'll help reduce consumer range anxiety and get them to consider electric as an actual alternative. Then we have building electrification. It's not the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions today, but it is dependent on fossil fuels, and it doesn't need to be. That's key. If we have a clean, affordable alternative, let's use it, and that's electricity. We can provide new standards and incentives to get 1/3 of space and water heating in homes and businesses electrified, and double energy efficiency in homes and businesses. By making all of this happen, cleaning our electric grid and electrifying, we will meet the state's goals, and more importantly, we'll help create healthier communities. The toughest part is all of this has to be ready and online by 2030, 12 years. If we want to reach that state goal. 12 years is the blink of an eye. We need to start down this pathway now. We need to form partnerships in each industry, and we need legislators and regulators to provide guidance and incentives. We need significant and speedy infrastructure development and market transformations. Just for a second, imagine a world where the energy that powers our lives and propels us forward is provided by the Earth's resources. That future is possible. This is the clean energy pathway, and together we can make this proposal a reality. So let's continue the dialogue, roll up our sleeves, and as Wally said earlier, let's just do it. Thank you.
being here. My name is Moja Rhodes, for those of you that don't know me and think my name is pronounced Moha. It's Moja. I find a lot of parallels between this work and my dissertation. They both took about 3 years to complete. They're technical. There's a big difference, though. When I was defending my dissertation, there were 3 people in the room. So now there's multiplied by a lot. But one of those people in the room was Marlon. Thank you, Marlon. And Marlon's here again. He reviewed the methodology behind this. Farron Piers also reviewed the methodology, so I'd also like to thank Jeremy for being here. Jackie, when she saw my presentation in the rehearsal, really liked my presentation, by the way. But she said, a couple of your slides are a little academic. I think that's a euphemism for technical and boring. That's true. There's a couple of slides that are academic and they're technical, but I'd really like to encourage people to have the patience with methodology because it's very important. It's necessary for our world, and we owe it to our constituents and the taxpayers to understand this stuff. We can't just leave this burden to academics and to consultants. It's a burden, and we all have to have patience with it. Okay, so on to the method, the technical. Fasten your seatbelts. Okay, so that's my title. The theme that I will try to present in this presentation is that if you want to do good planning and modeling, you need to get data and you need to use data. So what is climate action planning? We've been talking a lot about it today, but we haven't defined it. So for those of us that haven't been in climate action planning and don't know what it is, how is climate action planning different from any other type of planning? Well, what climate action planning does is it sets a target, it sets a goal, and it can be any goal. We can say in our city, we want to reduce emissions by 50%, we want to reduce emissions by 100%. You can set any goal you want. Climate action plans are generally set to legislative goals, AB 32. And they're done through different sectors. Building, energy, and transportation and land use are the largest emitting sectors. This forum is focusing on transportation and land use. And so climate action plans involve showing how strategically how we are going to meet these targets. And I just want to emphasize, what is the goal of a climate action plan? We get our goals mixed up, and that's fine, and we have multiple goals for the same thing, but within a climate action plan, the goal is to reduce emissions. And our secondary goals are enhancing mobility, considering cost, equity, time, and feasibility, but I don't want to lose sight of this goal because it's very important when it comes to methodology. So how do we show that we're going to reduce things? Well, I can't just tell you this works. Strategies require evidence, and evidence requires data. Otherwise, it's just talk. I can say that dog sledding reduces VMT. But you have to have evidence to show that it's going to work. So all CAPs, all climate action plans, use this document, at least all of the ones that I've read. Maybe something's happening within the last year. Maybe there's more manuals out there. But right now, the manual that is referenced for climate action plans, the evidence, is a document I called CAPCOA. CAPCOA is the California Air Pollution Control Officers Association, but I'll refer to the document as CAPCOA. So the CAPCOA is what is most widely used for all CAPs to show the evidence behind how we're going to meet our targets. CAPCOA has 50 land use and transportation strategies within the document, and amongst these strategies are parking strategies, pedestrian bike strategies, commute trip reduction strategies, road pricing, and vehicle strategies, which are electric vehicles. The land use strategy sees some of the highest GHG reductions in this manual, which I also want to say is that it's a CEQA manual, it's a project-based manual. And the land use strategies within CAPCOA do revolve around transit-oriented development and smart growth. And here's an amplification of the visual of the land use strategies. There's a large range in a lot of these. The project can see 1% to 30%, and the process here is a little bit of a black box. Not quite sure how we get from one end to another. It's not always well shown in the CAP documents. But The biggest thing about the CAPCO is it doesn't accommodate alternative strategies. It doesn't show what we can do with alternative strategies, so you're kind of beholden to the land use and transportations that are within this document, or you have to create your own methodology. So as you've seen before, the South Bay cities are built out. These are half-mile walking sheds around all the transit stops. So we see that most of the South Bay is not within walking distance of a transit station. Rail is on the left, bus rapid transit is on the right. And the cost of rail and bus rapid transit is exorbitant. Heavy rail runs around $1 billion per mile, light rail somewhere in between, and even bus rapid transit to build it is exorbitant. And so even in a much more networked LA where we see where transit investment increases and we see a much more networked system, transit ridership unfortunately has continued to fall within the last couple of years. And VMT is on the rise again. It took a little dip there because of the recession, but it's on the rise again. So when we consider reducing emissions, we have to get honest about how we travel. And within the South Bay, we are primarily traveling with an automobile. 88% of trips are in the automobile. And why is that? Well, the automobile provides point-to-point flexibility. It's the easiest system. It's the easiest system to use out there. Walking is also a big secondary mode in the South Bay. Walking also provides, by the way, point-to-point flexibility. And so the private sector, Lyft, and Uber, Via is one of the cool new things coming from New York, is simulating point-to-point flexibility. It's actually even doing it better. I have a chauffeur now that's taking me from a point to another point. I can do whatever I want. No, not really. They don't like it when I eat. But the private sector is simulating this point-to-point flexibility, which is what transit really has to start thinking about, is how does transit compete in this environment, and how does it start enhancing, trying to simulate some of that point-to-point flexibility that the private sector and the automobile is giving. So not only do we have to get honest about how we travel today in order to reduce emissions, we have to be honest about how we will continue to travel. So we need strategies that preserve this point-to-point flexibility, encourage walking, and decrease emissions. And so we've talked a lot today about our neighborhood-oriented strategies. And one of the things I want to say is that these strategies didn't come out of the air. They came out of our studies. They came from evidence themselves. We found the evidence. We found how people will use electric vehicles, how they travel, and then we developed strategies around this evidence. And one of the good things about neighborhood-oriented strategies is they equitably address all types of neighborhoods, enhancing access and mobility without requiring large expenditures. And that's important because all types of neighborhoods should contribute to GHG reductions, not just high density and transit communities. So alternative strategies call for new methodologies that are data-based, and that's what we've done. A couple of things before I go into the I don't really go into the nitty-gritty of this methodology. It's more of a wide-angle view. But there's a couple of benefits to this strategy, to the methodology that has been developed. Does anybody know how many people here know what a TAZ is, a transportation analysis zone? Okay, maybe about 10%. So all VMT modeling and GHG emission modeling uses TAZs, transportation analysis zones. And transportation analysis zones are really try to actually simulate census tracts, so they're relatively administrative boundaries, not really having to do much with transportation. But yet we're doing all this modeling around this. How do people move from one TAZ to the other? Well, what this neighborhood-oriented approach does is it looks at communities, it looks at neighborhoods, with an anchor point as the central focus. And here we looked at major and major intersections as the anchor point, but the anchor point can be anything. It can be anything that we want to see attract destinations or build around. And the anchor point could be Torrance City Hall right now and the surrounding communities. So it's flexible in the way that it starts looking at neighborhoods and the surrounding households. I will not start to talk to you about sigmas and all these equations. I have a couple of issues with these equations on the board, but I won't go into that. But when you use CAPCOA as a city or a region, what you're doing is modeling. You're using these equations that are based on studies that could have really taken place anywhere in Portland, or, and then you're modeling your outcome based on these equations. Well, our methodology isn't doing that. It's actually looking at our rich database. It's just directly observing behavior from our rich database, which I will talk about in a second. So this methodology is a data-driven approach that assesses neighborhoods. So we have 15 years worth of local data from 3 large-scale studies. And we're in a unique position to contribute to climate action planning for the majority of California neighborhoods. So our first study, the land use study, really looked at it did a lot of things, but I'm simplifying it. Why do South Bay residents walk? Around 2,000 residents were surveyed around these 8 different destination clusters. And we found that the density of businesses, how much you have available near you, explains walking, and the higher density business higher density of businesses that you have nearby you, the more you'll walk and the more you'll visit the area. The next 2 studies we did was the NEB and the BEB studies, and we placed cars in 55 households, each for a period of 2 years. And we took GPS units and we put them in the electric vehicles, and then we also put them in all the other vehicles in the household. So we got a total household travel. And what it did was provide us an extraordinarily rich database, about 40,000 trips for a total of around 1,500 days. The next best thing that you have is our household travel surveys. So the California Household Travel Survey, the CHTS, it happens once a decade. And it interviews people for 1 day of travel. So Wally, what did you do today in travel? And that's it, and then they leave. So that database provides us with 2,000 trips for 1 day of travel. So we have just much more robust data with which to start building our efforts. This is an example of what the raw data looked like. We had thousands and thousands and thousands of pings of GPS data. We were able to follow routes, see where people traveled, where they visited, in all of their vehicles. This is just to show that the data are sexy. But what this also shows is that people traveled in their battery electric vehicles exactly like they traveled in their internal combustion vehicles. So the outcome of the methodology that was created was to build upon CAPCOA strategies, to introduce new land use strategies, integrate parking strategies, build upon telecommuting strategies, and electric vehicle strategies. Oh, did I just shut this off? I pressed the wrong button.
Let's see if I can push the right one.
Ah, there we go. Brilliant. Okay, I won't do that again. Wonderful, thank you. So yes, we're building upon CAPCOA. So the remaining slides will just brush over the methodology. As I said, I used 3 main studies to provide all of the baseline data to populate this tool. And so what does this slide mean? We've talked about mode by distance, and Jackie saw this. So what is this telling me? Well, it's telling you that modes go by distance, travel by distance. Okay, what this is really telling you is that if we want to build an integrated approach, so if we want to consider how land use strategies interact with mobility strategies, how mode split happens, how mode transfer happens, if we want more walking to happen, well, we have to understand how modes play out in space. So walking generally doesn't happen beyond a half a mile from the household. Bicycle trips don't tend to happen. One-way bicycle trips don't tend, the data show that bicycle trips don't tend to happen beyond 3 miles. The neighborhood electric vehicles are generally not driven beyond 10 miles. And long-distance trips can be provided by battery electric vehicles and rail and telecommuting. The other thing that the data kind of laid out was that how do we make trips, and what does that mean with VMT? And so 30% of our 70% of our trips are under 3 miles, but 70% of our VMT happens over 3 miles. So long distance trips are just as important as short distance trips. And one of the things we want to think about doing is how do we bring some of those longer trips closer to home through things like telecommuting. So what I did to demonstrate the tool, because I built a tool and demonstrate it, is I looked at 41 potential neighborhoods at major intersections as well. I showed with the neighborhood centers. And I ran the numbers for these 41 tools. And I looked at each of these distance categories, half mile to 3 miles, 3 to 10, and over 10. And calculated average household VMT reductions for each of these distances in each of these modes. And what I did was I looked at the short term, because land use plays out in the long term, right? So we want to be looking at what happens in the short term, and what happens in the short term is we can work with electric vehicles now. So I differentiated by short term and long term, and I look at each of these strategies, and I look at each of the modes, and I used all of our data to populate all of these tables and figure VMT reductions. I did it for a half mile to 3 mile radius, 3 to 10 and over 10, separating work from non-work trips. And then the average household reductions are applied to the neighborhood population. So around a major intersection, one of these neighborhoods, lives about roughly 5,000 households. So then I take the average household reduction and multiply it by the number of households affected. And here some assumptions are being made. One of them, the assumptions that I made, was that we'll see 1% NEV-BEV penetration. That equates to about 50 households. One of the reasons why land use strategies are very important is because they potentially affect every single household in the surrounding neighborhood. So I applied land use, average land use reductions to all of the households nearby. And that's why land use is important when we talk about land use and transportation. But one of the things that I want to mention is that the tool is highly flexible to all these assumptions. All of these assumptions can be varied, they can be tested. This provides scenario planning for cities and any entity that wants to explore the different concepts. And most scenario planning tools out there aren't very transparent, which is one of the problems that I have. They're very difficult to figure out what are all the underlying assumptions. This tool is 100% transparent. So taking all of those 41 neighborhoods, I calculated that the average neighborhood will see a 3% reduction before land use, and that's given the assumptions. If we're more aggressive, if we say 50% of households start using electric vehicles, that'll go way up. But these are with conservative assumptions. And then after land use, there will be a 15% reduction in GHG emissions. And this applies to 50% of the households in the intersections that I calculated. Once again, the assumptions are highly flexible. We can test all these different scenarios and also update. With more studies and more information, all of this should be updated. And the second part of this is implementation and tracking implementation. So we can go out there and institute all of these things, implement all of these things, but if we're not tracking what's actually going on, if we're not seeing, okay, how many people are purchasing electric vehicles, how much is walking and bike mode share going up, how many households are telecommuting, if we're not going and seeing if these strategies are actually taking effect, we'll never know the success of the strategies. So indicators are a key component to this process, and then they go back in and feed the methodology and feed the tool. And I also do want to emphasize that we have really a lot of data available to us that planning is not getting a hold of. Sensors everywhere, sensors in our cars, on our phones. Everybody else is collecting information about us. Google knows everything about what I do. We're not doing that. And so we could be moving away from modeling to directly observing what it is that we're doing and understanding what it is that we're doing, and we are not doing that. And we need to be doing that. And before-after studies too. So this is really important. This is not done enough either. I implement a strategy, I implement some land use strategy. I need to know what happened before with travel, and I want to know what happens afterward. So one of the takeaways is that A lot of funding for land use and transportation planning requires methodology to show GHG reductions. There's some planning tools out there. Like I said, the assumptions are embedded, so I don't like using tools that I don't understand what they're doing. But there's right now no other choices beyond CapCo that are publicly available. So a lot of stuff happens in the back room. And so new methodologies need to be created new methodologies need to be created, and all methodologies need to be made public, they need to be updated, and they need to be transparent. So, my last slide. If you want to do good planning and modeling, you got to get data, you got to use it, and you have to maintain data to evaluate performance. So that's the end. Thank you. And we'll invite Jeremy and Marlon up to answer a few questions.
We're mixing the program as the commentators later, but we wanted to ask Jeremy and Marlon to come up because they were on our team and helped sort of evaluate if what we were doing made sense. I kept saying, I'm the layperson, and I kept saying, well, who's going to, what are people going to say? We're coming out with this idea on our own, and, how do we know it's right? And so Fair and Peers, with Jeremy Klopp's organization, worked on CapCoa, and they also helped us. And so we're delighted that we had that kind of expertise to help us along the way. And then, as you know, Marlon has been our guy all along. So I guess what I wanted to ask you to start off with is, what work did you do on the contract, and what is your impression? Can you just give us your overall impression, both of you?
Okay. Thank you, Jackie. Let me start. First of all, in 2005, the Neighborhood Travel Survey, the survey that had the 2,225 persons who were surveyed about their travel, which really is a lot of the basis of the neighborhood-oriented development plan. So I was the person who was the key technical consultant to the consulting team. I designed that survey. We did it. It was a lot of fun, and we learned quite a lot, and it was an amazing opportunity to be involved with a COG. One thing you have to remember, our data sources in transportation tend to be very limited, and a lot of people don't understand this because they think there must be a lot of data out there. To understand travel in that way from our existing data sources, we probably could have pulled about maybe data on 80 to maybe 100 households for the 8 neighborhoods that the COG was studying, which would have meant that we would have been able to know nothing. So it really required an original effort. And then Moja has been keeping me in the loop on what you just saw, really using the data sources as a scenario planning tool to answer the question, if you have some neighborhood-oriented development, if you move to electric vehicles, if you telecommute, if you have some parking policies, how do you quantify the GHG reduction? I have seen the spreadsheets. I have worked with the spreadsheets. I have followed them cell by cell. I think that's a lot of fun. My wife has informed me that that is one indicator that I am a strange person. And so anyway, but no, it is a very data and fact-based and sound methodology. So.
Well, I'll second that and say when we come into efforts like this, we come with a healthy degree of skepticism because our name's going to be on the line. And it was great to engage with the COG and Moja and Marlon and sort of explore the data that they, unlike almost any other region that we've dealt with, we work all over the state and we're really intimately aware of the CapCoa guidance. South Bay COG has just got mounds more data than anyone else does on travel behavior related especially to electric vehicle use. And the questions they've answered around will people travel more or less or differently in a NEV, BEV are really groundbreaking. So we tell your story elsewhere around the state. For this effort, Fair and Peers was engaged to help bring that technical choice to the South Bay cities in a way that staff and elected officials could pick and choose from among various strategies. I was in Rolling Hills Estates last night for the approval of the Climate Action Plan, and that's what the questions were about. Are the strategies that are in this Climate Action Plan for Rolling Hills Estates, do they really reflect our community? Do they reflect what we would want to do locally along these lines? And so our charge was to take a lot of that research that had been done and put it into, again, a very transparent spreadsheet type model, but one where you could pick citywide strategies that you might want to implement, one that you could say, in this particular TAZ, we are going to do these 3 or 4 strategies, but not these others, and have the tool automatically pull the data from that research and quantify in a very quick response way what would be the outcomes. And then you can maybe make different choices. Well, what if we don't think we can get that bike facility change aspect done? How much does that affect what happens with our VMT and GHG reduction? So part of our charge was really to make that more quick response so that it isn't sort of tell us what you want to do and we'll come back 6 months later and we'll do all the technical work and then we'll tell you, oh, here's what you get. But really to make that more interactive and sort of quick and on the fly and locally customizable.
Great. Thank you. As the state's going to VMT, are you aware of other efforts to revise the modeling efforts to conform to some of these new concepts? Do you know of any?
You want to talk about that?
Let me preface that. The modeling happens at a lot of different geographies. The metropolitan areas, for example, the Skag region, which has 19 million people, the metropolitan areas do their regional travel model. There is a lot of traffic impact modeling, which is almost intersection or street segment based, which has been wrapped up a lot with CEQA. Their cities run their own traffic models, which tend to be a little more traffic impact based. You know, how much street do we need? There's been somewhat of a missing middle, first of all, that not a lot of the regional COGs, which is where a lot of these neighborhood decisions happen, are doing efforts of this sort. So I think and I hope that what the South Bay COG is doing can exert some leadership statewide. In terms of the mechanics of how these models work, I don't want to go too far into the weeds. Each of these different geographies has a different method. What you have seen right here is what I would call a scenario model, a what-if tool. If X happened, how much would GHG go down? That is quite a growing trend, an important trend, because this is what you as citizens, as decision makers, want to know. In our community, if something happened, what is the impact? You need options. You don't want anyone telling you what to do. You want to make your own decisions. And I do think that scenario planning framework is definitely a growing trend.
I think that's a great way of framing it because cities are responsible to share their forecast changes and their desired development patterns and transportation improvements upward to their neighbors and to the region, so that as the regional transportation plan is updated periodically, those vision and value and investment elements at the local level are accounted for at that regional level. But you're right in that there is this sort of missing middle. We evaluate projects in very great detail, typically for mostly auto performance metrics, and that's changing a little bit with Senate Bill 743 passing and a shift to more attention on VMT as opposed to traffic level of service. But the other aspect about all of these modeling endeavors is that we are very much looking back and saying, if things continue the way they have been going, let's forecast and assume things will stay the same. But as was noted earlier, there are some fairly disruptive things happening right now, and especially with the rise of shared mobility and transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, there are many of us in the industry saying, boy, if those vehicles are autonomous, if they're very inexpensive, if private capital continues to throw hundreds of millions of dollars at these companies so that they can offer us travel at very low prices, that may change things dramatically. One of the endeavors we undertook last year as a company because we hadn't seen this research, we said, well, what do these regional models do if 50% of the fleet is autonomous? What happens to VMT? What happens to transit? And we took 7 MPO models from across the state, and what we found is that VMT went up in all of them. We changed things like parking cost. We changed things like terminal time. That's a fancy word for saying, how long do I have to wait before the vehicle arrives, and how long do I have to wait from when I get out of the door to where I'm going? And that's, any of you who have used Uber or Lyft, it's one of the best parts, right? You can just watch and wait and see. No terminal time. You just walk out there, you get in the vehicle. When you get to your destination, it leaves, and you are at your destination. Very low terminal time. And we also modified the value of time. So we said, well, these models are built to account for the fact that you really need to be focused while you're driving, or even if you're a passenger. How does that change if you can do whatever you like while you're in that vehicle and your value of time changes? And those parameter changes were really striking. And what they told us is that if those trips continue in ICE, internal combustion, carbon-intensive ways of travel, we're actually going to be exacerbating the problem, because travel is going to be easier and travel is going to be more and probably further as well. So I would just encourage, as we think about these modeling and these tools and questions about what will happen if, that we're thinking about those outcomes of serving customers better and maybe more enjoyably may also mean they're going to consume more. And most of the industry around transportation, whether it's automakers or whether it's transportation network companies, their business is to sell you more travel. They want you to travel more. If you drive your car more, there's more wear and tear, you need to get a new one. If you're a TNC, we want you to buy more of our services. So we're going to work really hard to give a great customer experience. We're going to brand and market those things well, and we're going to get you excited about consuming more of it. And if our goals related to climate are counter to that, we've got a big uphill battle. So that's, the modeling piece is an important tool to understand that, but there's a whole imagination and sort of customer component that I think is critical to this too.
The capacity of cities, they're so small, many cities, and they don't have the staff to do all of this. We've been able to do a lot of this as a sub-region by cobbling together grants over the last umpty years. Is there a role for the MPOs and the state? If data is so important, how do we get that middle finance? I mean, maybe not the right people to ask, but what are your impressions of how do we take care of that? Is it truly important? And if it is really important, then do you have any suggestions for how to make it happen?
Data is really important. This is a softball, question, right? I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah, data is important. So a couple of thoughts on that. There was a mention that maybe the state should assist in purchasing some of these private sector databases and then licensing them out to sub-regional COGs, to cities. That is a wonderful idea. The South Bay is an example of what you can do if you have these data. And imagine what we could do statewide if every city could look at this with this granularity. And the way that would have to happen is for Sacramento to devote some resources, our state representatives, to help the locals. The other thought, the best data source for transportation right now is from smartphone data. Google, Apple in particular, have the best travel data of anybody. Those are private, they are proprietary. I know this is a difficult and complicated discussion, but somehow we are going to have to open up this question of how can the public sector benefit from those data. The biggest land use in any city in the U.S. is streets and roads and parking. Residential is number 2. Our transportation system is our biggest land use. It is our biggest greenhouse gas emission sector. We have a large public interest in knowing how people travel. And so there's a pressing public interest in going to these technology companies and finding how we can learn from their data. And I understand that those are private sources, but what I am saying is that we are going to have to navigate this. The answer of private is private, never touch it. will lead to a world that we really don't want to live in, where there's a lot more driving, where we have not reduced GHG emissions, where our neighborhoods don't have the neighborhood-oriented development that you saw. And so I don't want to scare you too much, but I want to scare you just enough to think about how we get those data.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. Part of it comes into just the mechanics of these things. What does a data sharing agreement look like? What is legally defensible? What's enforceable? What level of entity, state, local, regional is best positioned to negotiate that agreement and to enforce that agreement? And the answer to that question may be different for speed data that we can get from a single vendor pretty handily, and we will know how fast people are traveling on most of our streets, than it might be for cell phone data that's coming in from many different cell phone data providers and many different data aggregators. And the companies aggregating that information and reselling that information, transportation planners are not their top customer, honestly. We're kind of a very small blip on their market. Their market is really driven by the major retailers. If you're Nike and I can tell you how far people are traveling to every one of your stores and from what income zones and from what neighborhoods people are coming and going to and from your store, they are well capitalized and they're buying that data. So one of our challenges is building arrangements here that at the state and regional level, the folks we're asking to either partner or to provide or to sell us that data, we're generally a fairly small customer in their mind. But I'll give you a couple local government examples. Uber and Lyft wanted to go to Austin, Texas. Austin said, not until you treat your employees differently. And it's our public right-of-way. You may not have access to it until you operate differently. And that proliferated a whole bunch of other similar providers, which from a customer experience standpoint was not as great. If you go visit Austin and you've got one of those apps on your phone, but not one of the 14 other ones, you know, in those early days, that was an inconvenience for customers. But Austin took that position. Another approach, Seattle said, you know what? We're just going to charge 14 cents per mile or per ride. So if you're a transportation network company and you want to operate in Seattle, no problem. 14 cents per ride is going to cover the cost of us having to manage the curb differently. It's going to cover the cost of potential congestion impacts we see might be associated with increased, glorified taxi use. And they built a monetary way to recover some of the additional cost of allowing that commercial operation in their right-of-way. So I think as we think about the transformation of the right-of-way, especially when we have increasing use of the right-of-way for commercial purposes, that cities get ahead of that conversation about what do you want from your streets? What is the best performing collective use in public space that is our streets? In many cities, it's 40% of the land area. We manage our sidewalks and the commercial activity on those sidewalks differently than we do on a private parcel. And we have the opportunity to do the same thing with commercial operators, especially as you start getting more zero occupant vehicles that maybe are just driving around advertising all day, every day, with a big billboard. So as we imagine an autonomous future where there's less direct ability to control what's happening in the right-of-way, we want to be thinking about those policy changes.
I wanted to ask if there's people in the audience that want to ask any questions. We have somebody? Okay.
Turning the question around, can the collective citizenry come back and say, well, we don't want this in our neighborhood unless you give us 14 cents on the ride? Where does that come in?
One of the big challenges with the changing character of the use is access to decision makers. Chicago went through this same exercise when they sold their parking meters to a private entity. Well, why didn't those meter prices change very much before? Because you could go complain to your alderman or alderwoman and they could keep the price where it was. Well, once it was in a different structure, you could say what you like, but it's done. So understanding the ability you have as a city and asking your elected officials, what limits and opportunities do we have legally and contractually to permit operation in the right-of-way is a great question to ask your public works and planning staff and your elected officials. There's a whole permitting structure around many different things that happen in the right-of-way, and tapping into that and framing the conversation around what's happening in the right-of-way and who decides, and if there's a cost associated with that, who pays and how much it should be, is a way of managing the right-of-way more actively. And we've done that with the curb and parking, time management and price management in some places. But I think it's going to only get more complicated and more important as the demands on the right-of-way change.
We have a question over here. Jim?
Yes. Have you looked into some of what the policies are in Europe? For instance, London now has a 13-pound charge for diesel vehicles to go in the city center. Mm-hmm. All cabbies are going to have to be EV by 2018. They're going to be banning diesel, banning gas. Do you use any of that information to help policymakers decide or help that data, how that works? And have you looked at incentives versus mandates? There's kind of different impacts of each.
Yeah.
Well, let me mention in the tool that Moja described, which is the tool that the COG has used built for the climate action planning process. I think the answer is yes. It sets you up to look at a lot of these questions. In terms of how you get there, the incentives, how do you incentivize? There's still a little more work to be done. Let me explain what I mean, because you asked about like a congestion toll or things such as that. There's 4 kinds of policies that are in the COGS tool right now. Electric vehicles and what fraction of households take those up. And the baseline assumption was 1% of households, very low. Neighborhood-oriented development. And the baseline assumption was those 41 places you saw on that map have a neighborhood-oriented development scheme that will move more trips that are in that half-mile to 3-mile range into the half-mile. So there's trip shortening there. Telecommuting. And if I remember, I think the baseline assumption was half of the households that could telecommute based on their occupation, telecommute 1 day a week. And then parking, and I'm blanking on exactly what the parking assumptions were, but some amount of reduced parking at the workplace. So with all of those, you could play games of, what if these assumptions aren't right? And so you're well set up to do something like, what if we had a toll of some sort that drove more people to maybe an electric vehicle if the toll did not apply to them, drove people to more trip shortening? You've got an excellent basis to pursue that. It's a quantification tool. So the second thing you asked of how could you incentivize localities to pursue these policies is not as much in the tool now. And a little bit of that's more of the political implementation question. So that's really, I think, more of a discussion, kind of on council, in the COG, amongst your advocates of, what would be the ways we'd want to get there. One way to think about it, on the electric vehicle, if the target was 1% of households or 10% or 20% adopting an electric vehicle, you have a tool right now that could tell you, what happens to GHG emissions. How do you get to 1% or 10% or 20% of households driving an electric vehicle? That's a policy discussion that you can't go to the spreadsheet. You'd have to sit down and say, what could we bring to bear? What could the state help us with? So the spreadsheet can help you on the analysis. It doesn't help you as much with the politics. Does that help?
I'll just add briefly that I think anytime you start talking about pricing, people get real sensitive about what exactly are we trying to accomplish here and why are we doing this. So I think if you look at the successful pricing examples, someone mentioned it earlier, greenhouse gas emissions and climate are great goals, but I think it was Alan, they're only one of multiple things the city is trying to deliver for its residents and visitors and employees. And sometimes congestion relief is really a bigger deal to the customer than the environmental outcomes. So the places where you see successful cordon pricing or even the toll lane experience we've had in SoCal, it's very much in service of congestion relief and reducing congested conditions on the network that we have. And so I think knowing what the target of major modification to behavior, especially through pricing incentives or disincentives, you got to make sure that those objectives are really well supported politically by the vast majority of the constituency before going down those paths, or they just won't get very far. And I think building support for that, and we're seeing increased support for that in this region over time. I mean, all those toll lanes and express lanes began as pilot projects that may or may not have persisted, but for the success they've been having and for the revenue they're creating. And the other thing I'll say about that is, much like a parking benefit district, if your component, your revenue that's coming from that doesn't stay local enough, that's another risk. So in much the same way that Don Shoup likes to talk about parking revenues being set by local businesses and going back to local businesses as being successful elements of good parking pricing programs, the scale at which pricing happens in a region also has to have a good relationship back to where those revenues are going, and people are seeing those revenues as having a positive effect on the region that's paying for them as well.
So I think it would be helpful if there was a bunch of data corresponding policy with actual achieving your goal.
Mm-hmm.
That would be very helpful.
Agreed.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank our discussants or commentators today. I'm going to call Wally up. We're going to have you discussion again at the end of the program. But Wally's going to talk now about implementation and our call to action, how you move forward on these concepts. I want to thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Somehow, I hope you'll agree with me, this made methodology and all this technical stuff interesting. So thank you very much, and thank you, Mochi.
I'm glad our wives think so too. Yeah.
While we're changing things around, I wanted to just clean up a couple of things that I had kind of blown past earlier on. One was the question about vertical mixed use. And the issue there is that we live in a world that's already horizontal mixed use, and it really works to have very short trips. The idea with vertical mixed use really works well in a downtown. And so if you're in downtown LA or even downtown Santa Monica, you're looking at an environment that's dense and heavily populated and lots of visitors and people come into work and all that kind of stuff. It really makes sense in certain contexts. Our data don't suggest that it works very well when your basic floor plan is horizontal mixed use. And so if we're going to create these neighborhood centers, what we want them to be is highly magnetic. In fact, I had an earlier slide that had a whole tray full of magnets. They unfortunately look like cactuses, and everybody on the team said, don't do that. But the idea was to try and reinforce that it's about creating magnets, and you want them to be all destinations. And you've got horizontal mixed use already. There's another problem, which is that the markets mature in different ways. Ground floor retail has one sort of market, and housing above has another market, and sometimes you end up with vacant retail and these people above and so forth. Then there was also the argument I gave that in the end, the people who live above or next door don't begin to support the businesses on the ground floor. So what we're trying to do is to consolidate all the destinations in a way that you can walk to them from the horizontal mixed use part. So anyway, I didn't mean to just blow past it, but there are some good reasons why the South Bay probably is not a very good place for that. I also wanted to emphasize just a little bit the technology piece. I sort of rushed through it because it was at the end. I actually did this in the mid-90s in Compton, and the code name was Blue Line Televillage. It was widely successful. I mean, people loved it. We had members from all over Los Angeles County. And it is the infrastructure of all of the stuff that we're trying to do, from telecommuting to business support, to small business entrepreneurs and so forth. We actually had a guy who came from Wilshire and, what was it, doesn't matter, Wilshire and something, MacArthur Park. And he took the train down every day because we gave him an office space to incubate his business, which he did. And he subsequently moved out and got an office near MacArthur Park and employed 2 people. So this idea of having a pre-incubator incubator and having access to these tools is, I think, a very powerful one. And it's not like it's coming out of the ether. I did this 20 years ago, and actually more. And Metro funded it, and then that reminds me then of another one. I was talking to Steve Lance, who wanted to remind me that Measure M, the guidelines for Measure M are being developed right now, and it is entirely possible that a lot of our sustainability programs can be funded through Measure M going forward as we work out these the guidelines, the expenditure guidelines. And so, whereas Dan and others have said transit's a problem, it's expensive, it's not carrying many people, and so forth. The whole issue of the tax to support Measure M can be used in multiple ways, and we don't want to lose sight of that we actually appreciate having that pool of money, and we hope to make very good use out of it. I also wanted to say Dan Sturgis has an $800 Segway here. He's been riding it around. If any of you are interested, grab Dan afterwards, and I hope you have your insurance card with you, but no, I'm just kidding. It's a swell device, and if you're all interested, Dan will help you right on it. It's $800. It's exactly the kind of personal mobility device that we're talking about people could use all the time as opposed to their SUV. I also wanted to talk just for a minute about our team and Moja Roads in particular. Moja has been an incredible collaborator for 10 years working on this project with me, and we wouldn't be here without her excellent expertise in doing the quantification and so forth, which I don't even think in my prime I could have done that. I'm way too old to do it now, so that is thanks to Moja, but also Aaron Baum, also Aaron and Buck, who have been screwing around, been doing incredible work. And I just want to say that we all get paid, but we don't do it for the money. The people here, Moja for 10 years, Aaron for 25, we do it because we believe in this stuff. And so it's so rare in this world that you get people who are committed to ideas. And that's what we had here. We had a wonderful team. And the LARC team came in late. I'm talking about now decades worth of effort. Thanks, LARC. It was a great afternoon. No, you did a great job. We really appreciate it. For sure, for sure. Not to diminish the contribution at all. And then the final thing is all of this is possible because of the leadership at the COG. Jackie is a fantastic leader. It wouldn't happen without you, for sure. Okay, so let's go on. Close to myself. Oh, one other thing, yes. The idea of this remade material, the thing is we showed no parking. And the thing to realize is that once you started to convert retail strips to housing, you don't need the parking out front anymore. You put it around the back because it's residential parking. And that means you gain a whole lane, in terms of all this business about what are we losing with low speed, NEV lanes or low speed networks and stuff like that, is that it's all of it is a chicken egg. As you get into the transition, you see new opportunities. And you don't have retailers complaining, no one can drive up in front of their store because there's no store there anymore. It's all down at the neighborhood center where there is parking and electric charging and people can walk to it in great quantities. And then parking becomes an issue, and there isn't a city here that if you go in and talk to them about parking policy and reducing the requirements for parking, they will not go crazy. Everybody's very worried about parking. The fact is, if you're going to build neighborhood centers and people are going to walk to it, parking suddenly isn't the political leverage that it was before. And so we're, again, it's a chicken egg. We're trying to leap into the future, and some cities are going to have the courage to say, let us try a neighborhood center. Let us see if we can get by with less parking, because the parking is what makes the redevelopment of these things possible. Our economic analysis says, you know, with the housing and with the commercial centers, it's parking that drives the prices out of the ballpark. So, okay, all that. So let's go on. I'm going to talk a little bit, very little actually, about the co-benefits. Co-benefits are required by climate action plans. You can't actually, there's no budget to do any real analysis of it or anything like that, but they do want to know what else you can do. So I really covered economy and jobs a lot in terms of the neighborhood center, but we're talking about there being, let's take it a step further, talk about creating an economic engine inside each neighborhood. And it's the seed from which a neighborhood economy is going to grow. And so the idea of planting that seed and nurturing that seed sets up then the question, you're going to have inter-neighborhood trade. It's really trade. When I go to someplace outside of my neighborhood, I'm actually affecting some trade with that neighborhood. I buy something there, I come home with a good, I'm a visitor that goes there. So the notion here is that the law changed a few years ago, for example, about home-baked goods. I know this is crazy. But the law changed and said you can make home-baked goods and you don't have to have a certified kitchen to do it anymore. You can bring them down to a place like the neighborhood center and sell them even though you're just a person who likes to bake, you know, that kind of thing. Well, what we're talking about is all kinds of things that could be done out of household economies to contribute to the neighborhood economy if they only had some place to go and do it. So that's one of the things we're talking about with the center. In addition to the access to the digital economy and people doing 3D printing and home for telecommuters and small-scale entrepreneurs and so forth. So it's a very, the neighborhood center is very important in terms of economy and the jobs. Safer streets, well, we covered this a lot. If the vehicles are slower, then you're going to hurt fewer people. Also, the planners in the room all know Jane Jacobs and her famous thing about eyes on the street. You know, in Manhattan, there's so many people walking the sidewalk that their eyes aren't, or people are sitting up in their second-story tenements and looking down. What we're talking about here is Jane Jacobs on steroids. We're talking about people actually being on the street, seeing each other and knowing each other, and ending up down in the neighborhood center and meeting. I know when I worked in an office, we used to have you know, birthday parties, and I would always, I know these people, what do I want to go to their birthday party for? I wasn't well liked, okay. But I embraced it. But it's different if you run into people down the neighborhood center because we all have something in common other than working in this bureaucracy, is that we have the land uses around us, the value of the houses, the safety on the streets. We have a lot of things in common, and those are people I might want, no, I don't. Crazy idea. So we talked about vehicle diets and not road diets. Well, here's the chance you get killed by a car. This is by age. What does it say here? Oh, 20 miles an hour, but there's 3 curves. Look at the 70-year-old curve. Oh my God. We're talking about beating up on old people, right? You know, get out and take a walk. And here's 30. And then here's 40. It's like, well, geez, the mortality rate is like, I hope you have a will. That's right, we're slower. Thanks for. Yeah, I used to walk in my neighborhood, but I don't anymore after I saw these graphs. Okay, now security. This one is pretty interesting because I don't know if everybody's been here, but everybody remembers the Rodney King riots. Well, it was really exciting because there was no law enforcement for like 48 hours. I mean, you could go park at a red zone if you wanted. I did it just because I could, you know, it was really fun. But my neighbors, I remember we went out in the street and one guy he had a drugstore somewhere and he has this arsenal in his, you know, and there was all this rumors like, well, they're coming over the hill, you know, let's go shoot them, you know, kind of thing. The idea of having a place for 5,000 households to go meet that doesn't depend on mediated communications, that you can go there and it's got its independent electricity, it's got an all-on network and so forth, so that you can connect to the outside world if the power grid goes down or if there is another riot. It's a very important consideration as a social gathering place when one is really, really desperately needed. And then we're going to talk about expand consumer choices. And two kinds, not only mobility options. So, you know, right now you see all the ads and it's like a price and horsepower and, you know, design, all this kind of thing. What we're really interested in is the size, the price, the performance of what we're buying and the distance it'll go. We want to start buying things by the distance that we need. So mobility options are something that we're going to bring to our cities that they don't now have. And then there's the neighborhood options, because let's say several of your cities put in one of these neighborhood centers. And so I have a walking place to go that's really robust. It's got all this technology, and it's got really cool stuff, and I'm a home-based business, and I can go use it. Well, it's a new place type. And the question would be, does that start to attract people who have a choice of where they move? So there are lots of co-benefits here we like to do. Again, Dan said, just do it. We really want to do this. The mobility part is easier than the land use part. But the last thing, I didn't put it down because the question is, we don't know enough about the economics of it, but our preliminary analysis is that we can build affordable housing and somehow in this mix and townhome stuff. So let's not dwell on it, but it looks like that might be true. This is the investment equity question, and somebody else touched on it, but when you take a very, very expensive machine, like the Expo line, and it costs $1 billion to go end to end, $1 billion, that's a big investment in a channel. And then when you're expecting the city to be built around it through high-density transit-oriented development, that's another $1 billion or more to go around it. And it all goes into a channel. Yeah, there's some sort of spread effects, and that's very good. Our motto is, and the reason we showed these grids with all these centers and stuff, leave no neighborhood behind. What we're talking about is spreading that investment around so that every neighborhood benefits from a big public investment of this nature. And then you make a small private investment in these little vehicles because the public, with a private partner, has built these places that you can walk to and have a network of them. So all of your needs can be satisfied within 3 miles. Who wouldn't want that? But it's a difference of investment equity. That's what we're going to do. Okay, that's the end of that. This is the final. This is the final little run here. No one's dropped forward in their porridge yet, so I guess we're doing okay with the PowerPoint fatigue. Okay, so here's the thing. From our experience, and it is from our experience, and I think everyone has said we've collected a lot of data and we've done our homework and all this kind of thing. In the end of the day, it appears to us that the whole climate action planning doctrine, it needs to be revisited and revised, because I don't think it's getting us nowhere very quickly. So we're saying you want to reform and review the entire land use transportation planning paradigm that's now going on, because the CAPCOA reliance and so forth, it's just not going to help reduce carbon, and that's why we're going through and spending all this money, all this time. So I've got, I think, 7 things here. They're all just part of this, which is, hey, get out there and rethink what you're doing. Think critically about what you're doing. But we think we should, that suburbs deserve to have something other than an urbanized future or more suburban bloat, because 60 years of infill has not worked out very well in any suburb, and certainly not here. We're bloated. We can barely move. And so it isn't so much the growth that's coming as that we can fix the growth that already happened if we can remodel the floor plan. And that's what we need to think about, is how can we make things better? And it's not so much we're going to have all this growth, because we're not. But the state should, we hope, would appreciate this and get behind it and help suburban regions everywhere who want to maintain or go back to reclaim, let's say, some of their previous quality of life issues. Now, it's still self-serving, okay. The Council of Governments brings to this enterprise a kind of strategic perspective that the cities themselves don't have. And so whether it's a county, which is made up of multiple jurisdictions, or whether it's a joint powers authority, not a council of government, whatever it is, these JPAs, these multi-jurisdictional organizations, probably are a place I would advise the state to go look investing in, to do stuff on behalf of small cities that are part of them, because none of this would have happened in our small cities, really, without the COG being able to assemble the resources and bring a strategic multi-jurisdictional perspective to it, because the cities just don't. Local empirical data, I think we crushed this one with the various panels and so forth. Data, 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 and the rest of it is faith-based planning. I have said, I'm going to now be provocative, Jackie, I'm sorry, I'm already apologizing, and to my friend in the bicycle community, so much of bike planning is faith-based. And if we put these lanes in, then such and so will happen in terms of mode shift or mode share or something like that. I'm all for anything that reduces carbon, but I am also for measuring it. And when you cannot actually get behind, you don't have data that actually describes what happens to the mode share when you put in, say, a bike lane or a slow speed lane. The same thing applies to what we want to do. We want to have metrics on this so we know if we're getting our money's worth out of it, and is it really being effective? Because the bottom line is you've got to reduce carbon or we're going to be on fire. Jerry Brown says this is the new normal. We're going to be on fire every year. And I did mention the commercial databases, the Polk data, the Dun & Bradstreet, the cell phone data. This would all help immeasurably in how we're trying to cope with what's going on. The bicycling, for example, if we could get cell phone data from it, that would really help. But as it is, so much of it is faith-based. Okay, a manual for how you do this. We kind of invented this. Moja and I did not have any particular experience with this when we started, and boy, the learning curve was steep, but we went through it as quickly as we could. But if the state could come up with a manual that helped folks start moving into this database set of planning and policy and so forth. And one of the things I wonder, and I wanted to ask Marlon and Jeremy, but I didn't, is I've been always skeptical of the sustainable community strategy that the MPOs do. And they use these giant models, and it takes like 3 weeks to run, very expensive, and to collect data from the cities on land use and stuff. On the other hand, if we had, and this goes to 5 as well, as Marlon and Jeremy said, we've got a very transparent tool. I've asked 100 times for the, was it urban footprint, is that what it's called? The ones that, yeah, one of them. What's the sensitivity? What if I increase the number of telecommuters? How does that affect that? They absolutely can't tell you. They refer you to a 200-page technical article that no one could possibly read or understand. So there's something about having something that's simple and direct, even if it's less comprehensive than what it could be, but that any citizen, any policymaker could sit there and look at it and say, oh, I don't like that assumption, let's change it, let's do a sensitivity analysis. That's what we're talking about. And so the question I have is there any way, if we had a bunch of subregions doing this, that we could aggregate it into a sustainable community strategy as opposed to going to the top-down business where the MPO does it and then hands us the results and asks if we agree with it. And do we want scenario 1 or scenario 2? And you can never really I don't want any of those. I want scenario 7. And that's not possible in this world. So what we like about this is we've got something that's transparent, cities can use it, cheap to use, and easy to understand. We've all said we've got to be able to track what happens. I mean, for goodness sake. You want to do this stuff, there is hardly a climate action plan that I've seen that anyone goes back and says, well, do we even implement the actions we said we were going to do? And then secondly, did the actions they're going to implement actually produce what it was that we said, the metrics said we would get? There's so much of the state funding is aimed at what seems to be the dominant theme in regional planning and land use transportation planning, which is you got to build transit, rail transit if you can, and then you build transit-oriented development around it. And the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities Program, for example, only gives money for affordable housing to locations that are on a high-quality transit area, transit corridor. And this is, it's an urban strategy, and we want something that suburbs can apply to and get their affordable housing built. So why not? If you're building it around neighborhoods, why doesn't that count? Why does it have to be high-quality transit? Well, we don't have it. We'll never have it. And there's a 3% mode share. It makes no sense. I mean, there were places in El Segundo, I was told during this work, where there's a bus stop and no one's gotten on or off in 5 years. So, I mean, okay. Now, that's our sort of, this is what we hope the state will do. Now, here's what we're going to do, and we really, really would like your input on this. And your opinion of how this would go on. I've had several people come up and say, we need better marketing and all this kind of thing. But the point I want to make in the South Bay in particular, but I think all through the state, this is a really pivotal moment. The building stock is old. It was built in the 50s and 60s. It's the point where it either needs to be, better maintained, it needs to be modernized, or it needs to be replaced. And so we've got developers coming down. Also, we're adjacent to Silicon Beach, and so the money is pouring onto the west side. I mean, the developers are coming down here looking really at the South Bay as what a great opportunity. And there's not much high-rise here right now. And and so a lot of the question is, and we hear from some of our council people, well, the developer said this. And what we're trying to get to the point of is that, no, don't worry about what the developer says. You need to take your vision to the development community, and you want to tell them that's what you want here. And this is a special time. It goes all the way back to the 50s when all of this auto suburbs were first built on this particular development pattern, on this particular locations. It's time to renew this. It's time to sort of revise the floor plan. And so let's figure it out and let's tell the developers what we want. And there's no opportunity between 1950 and now that we can do it. Also, we've got all this technology-driven change right now, which is why you want to start including a technology component in anything that you do. And this is an opportunity because it's dry. As I said earlier, it's taking it's changing the retail presence tremendously. It's not eliminating face-to-face retail, but it's really changing its presence. And the carbon business is so important that we address it, that we have to tell the development community what we're doing. Anyway, this is a moment in time. That's what I'm trying to tell you. It's a moment in time that won't come again once all this stuff is built again, because now it's going to be there for another 50 years before you can change it again. Interesting thing about technology is that you can change it quickly, which is why I'd say you should start your neighborhood center part by finding out where you want to put a technology center, and then you'll see the rest of it grow around it. We have experience. We know this will work. Everybody loves technology. Not everybody, but in the end, you're affected by it, and you'd rather control it than it controls you. Okay, I will not let you take Dan's scooter now. This is out. Okay, so what are we trying to tell our cities? It's something really simple. Anything that you're going to do that's going to remodel or redevelop, you want it to contribute to a walking neighborhood. If we don't start now with every single development proposal that you have that comes across you, then we're never going to have walking cities, because you can't do it with this grand vision that can be all done at once. You have to do it a proposal at a time. So when you're dealing with housing developments, you want to be sure that you understand by doing the kind of NAICS analysis that I showed you. You want to know what's within walking distance, what destinations are within walking distance of that. The state law says infill is good. Infill. Turns out there's good infill and there's bad infill. I'll give you an example of bad infill. If you drive, where I live, I go down airport all the time to go to LAX. And as you get off La Tejera onto airport, there's this massive 5-story apartment buildings, one after another. This is bad infill, folks. It is infill. It is housing. But there's absolutely nowhere to walk to from there. There is no commercial center within a half mile or even a mile of there. You're next to LAX. So if you're going to do something like that, you want to start talking to other developers about putting in the destinations that complement that. You've got to have walking neighborhoods. And similarly, if you're going to do a commercial development, you want to make sure that you know what functionality is going in there, what NAICS are going in there, and how does that fit with the housing that's around it. It's just a vocabulary that I think is very important. This is what we're telling our cities. You can not listen. Okay, so where we're going is and we talked to Dan Sperling about this a lot, and Judy, and this is what we're trying to take to CARB and to other agencies to get funded. So we've done all this research, and now we're trying to go with a full-scale deployment of what we're talking about. Not so much the land use part, because it's very tricky and difficult to do, but the mobility part is simple. We got too many gasoline vehicles. We can't do much about the sales on the market with EVs, except at the low end, because we have all these tools that can affect the demand for slow-speed vehicles. We have the tools for that. We don't have the tools for those stuff. So the first thing we want is an exhibition of local use vehicles. People cannot buy which they don't have any experience with. And Amy over here will talk a lot about your experience with it, but nobody even knows what a Segway is. No one knows what electric roller skates are unless their kids are 12 or something and they're out buying them. So we want to have an exhibition of bringing all these different, and believe me, this space is very creative. There's a lot of innovation going on now. So we want to have this exhibition, and we're working with Judy and the AQMD. It's the sort of thing AQMD pays for. So we want to have an exhibition, maybe 2 or 3 of them, move it around into the neighborhood metaphor, so that everybody in the South Bay can go and get hands on any of these vehicles, anything from a golf cart down to a Segway. We want to get a right-ranging tool, and because, as I said, we know from our research experience and the focus groups that people don't know what they need. You know, you kind of know food-wise what you want. You know, everybody wants pasta or Mexican food at my house. But we don't know what we actually need for mobility. And as Dan is fond of saying, is if the car man comes every night to your door and rings the doorbell and says, "You've got 2 cars out there, it's $50 each, please." And you had to pay by the day for the car. That's roughly what it costs to keep 2 cars with insurance and purchasing and all that. You'd have a whole different approach to it, because my car's sitting in the garage for 5 days a week mostly. I work at home. And so I have way more mobility than what I need. And that's a classic car, and I don't want to sell it. But that aside, okay, that aside, we've imagined a right-ranging tool where you would sit down, you'd log on, and you kind of say what destinations you go to, how often you go. And the thing would have an algorithm that would come back to you and say, you know what, if you took, you could have 1 hybrid, 1 golf cart, and take Uber and Lyft on these other trips, and you'll save this amount of money, and you'll save this amount of carbon, and you'll reduce congestion. That's what we're talking about. We're trying to get that funded as well. They all go together as a piece. We'll go forward with some of it if we have to. Okay, then the South Bay Clean Vehicle Rebate Program. As we know, the state is now paying consumers $2,500 each if you buy a big battery vehicle. You get a subsidy, cash subsidy. There has been a proposal put forward that says that should go up to $10,000. That's when Jackie and I leaped into action and said, what? And it's going to cost over $1 billion to do that annually. And we said, what? Before you go spend $1 billion willy-nilly, why don't we try it at the low end, what we've been talking about? And so we want, and the car staff, senior staff, is, as you can imagine, are apoplectic and really struggling with swallowing this. But Sperling and Mitchell have kept the door open for us, and so we were going to Sacramento in January to talk to folks and say, hey, let's try it. You know, if it doesn't work, if we don't save carbon, if we don't sell any more vehicles, okay. And it would be a third off, whatever the price is, up to $3,000. So if it's a $9,000 gem, get it for $6,000. They'll fly off the shelves. If it's a $900 electric bike, get it for $600. Fly off the shelves. Not necessarily because the $600 to $900 is such a big deal. It's just that the splash that this would make in bringing attention to the fact that this is a market that is vital and good. And by the way, there's a lot of innovation in it. So we're working hard on that, and that is the cornerstone of it all. But the Love Exhibition is also a part of it. We've got the plan. I told you Cotty did this plan for slow-speed network that doesn't take away lanes and just routes things with signage and so forth. We've got a proposal in the Caltrans to do a feasibility study of about a third of that network. And so we're hoping to get that funded and go forward. The charging infrastructure is sort of not there at the moment, but we think we can get funding from AQMD to go ahead and start putting in level 1 charging. Again, your bigger vehicles all require level 2. They don't require it, but that's the thought. If you can get by and somebody plugs into a 110, why wouldn't you do that? It's cheaper, it's ubiquitous, it's simple. This is what we're saying. You start thinking in terms of, wow, the support infrastructure for this is what. And then we want to evaluate the whole thing, and we're trying to work with various universities to come up with a study design going in. And are you listening? Yeah. And this is just my favorite to take to CARB. We want to turn your program upside down and stop subsidizing the high end and start subsidizing the low end. And like I said earlier on, our multi-family dwellings do not have the infrastructure to support charging this stuff at home. So So you may not like the fact that we're asking you to do small battery stuff, but the fact is you're doing big battery stuff that has no business. There's nothing we can, no one here can actually buy it if you live in it. So we're losing 50% of the market because we can't charge it at home. Okay. And there we are. Some truth in that, huh? Yeah, and we're going to bring our final panel up, and then everybody can go home early, I might add. Amy.
Well, I just want to give you a stipulation. I just wanted to say that as I have an NEV dealership myself in Redondo Beach, I drive them all the time. My SUV is dead, underground, 7 feet under. But most importantly is that there are actually level 1 charging stations all over. It's just that they're not turned on and accessible to people who have an NEV. Like all along the waterfront corridor there's where all the Christmas tree lights are all lit up.
Oh, yes.
Right? So, but they aren't turned on during the day. So when someone runs out of battery or whatever and they want to go and plug in a 110, they can't because they're, I don't know, they're worried about stealing electricity. I don't know. But anyway, if those were turned on, that would solve a little bit of the issue.
Well, we're going to meet with you next week and go over. We're going to give us some information that I hope will help us with the proposal to CARB, and then you'll tell us some of these things that we can then filter into the policy stream and see what we can do. Okay, so Marlon and Jessica, where's Jessica? Jessica, come on up.
Met Marlon and Alan, right? And we're adding Jessica Nini. Jessica is a friend of the COG. She is working with us on a lot of the Measure M guidelines, which is the new sales tax. But Jessica is the director of Investing in Place. And Investing in Place represents consumers of transportation, but also environmental equity, social equity, and she is has her pulse is in the community. And so we wanted to make sure that we got your perspective and you could hear from Jessica about all these things she's heard today. So let's start with just your initial reactions to some of the state ideas, and I don't know who wants to start. Jessica, you haven't talked. Do you want to open it up?
Sure. A lot of ideas. I am actually someone who has lived in Los Angeles for about 20 years without a car. One of my motivations being environmental. Also, I don't like to drive. And then it was economical when I moved to LA. So the idea of reducing our carbon footprint on the way we travel is very personal for me. And one of the reasons I began working as a transportation advocate is I really felt the experience of walking and biking and catching the bus. I'm one of those 0.0%, I think, that we heard from Dr. Sperling, who still uses transit. And so, but I felt that the user experience was less than ideal. Lack of dignity, lack of safety. For us here in LA County, almost 40% of our roadway deaths are people walking and biking. So for me, I work a lot in the space of, and as a region in Los Angeles County, we've chosen to invest less than 1% of all of our transportation funding to our sidewalks, to our crosswalks, to our bicycle lanes. So there's a reason we pay for it with our lives. Thank goodness Measure M changed that situation. Our first transportation sales tax ever in this region to actually dedicate money to first, last mile, to safe routes to school, to things like that. So where my head is at and where I listen to all this stuff is how do we implement it? How do we use Measure M funds? And what the South Bay will kind of be the implementer, the manager on is the multi-sub-regional funds programs. For the first time ever, we've created funding that will flow through all of our 9 sub-region COGs. So this critical role of pulling together the jurisdictions to spend our tax dollars on mobility, where do you use this data? And Moja is a dear friend of mine, and so seeing that methodology I think is really important, but how do we translate that into implementation? So lately, I spend a lot of time concerned about the wonderful money Measure M has and the lack of community support it has for implementation. One way to reduce VMT, create dedicated bus lanes, to fix our sidewalks and crosswalks, to create safe bike lanes. But we see tremendous challenges for elected officials who are brave enough to do that. And so what I think I'm kind of hungry for in a lot of these spaces is what are the steps to implementation, and how do we, say, flip the script on community engagement so that when we go to spend this innovative transportation money that can improve safety, improve our public health. I don't know, I for one don't really want to roll 3 blocks to my grocery store. I would actually like to be able to walk safely, so how do we create those public health benefits for all that stuff, but have the community support to spend our money that way? It can sound like creating dedicated bus lanes is a lot of money, but just keep it real that we spent $1 billion on the 405 to expand it by 1 lane with no real added benefits. So there's still a real tension for me of being honest about where we're spending our money and why. And this idea of all of our trips, many of our trips are under 3 miles. How do we make those safe? Most people do want to walk. And I actually think 3 miles is the sweet spot for transit. When I'm riding the bus over 3 miles, the average bus speeds for Los Angeles bus riders is 7 to 8 miles an hour. So until we create dedicated bus lanes, which Measure M has money for, I totally agree. Transit is a real drag. I lifted down here today because I don't own a car. And so where my head is at is all this data, these goals that I completely share, but also, like as Alan mentioned, their livability goes, how do you translate into spending this precious measure of money that we have in front of us that is completely for all these ideas, but we struggle with implementation?
I think what Jessica's talking about a little bit is something I've been thinking about a lot, and today came up a lot. How do we engage the community? Because the state has really aggressive goals, and then it kind of trickles down to the regional planning organizations, but it's up to the communities themselves to really implement a lot of this. And I think there's a lot of politicians who really espouse their fight on climate change and adaptation and climate planning. But how do we get the community involved? I think this is kind of an important point, because ultimately, I don't know, we live in a kind of a participatory culture now. And I think the best ideas come actually not from the top down, but from the bottom up. And the question is, how do we engage the community in climate discussions? Especially since we talked about it, it's very diverse. LA as a region, the South Bay is very, very diverse. And you have so many different kind of mobility attitudes. There are really people that do want more sustainable transport because they're green. They believe in green. There are others that are just more practical, like taking a bus is a much better option. There are others that love technology and may adopt things because of a technological focus. But we have this really diverse population. So not only do we have to engage the community, we have to engage a very diverse community. And I'd be curious to hear from cities too how they think the best way to do that is.
Well, my reaction, I'll just tell you my reaction to what you both said, is that the message for today is really it's not one size fits all. And when we talk about community and when we talk about bus lanes or whatever, we really have to talk about we have to recognize, and I think this is the frustration that the South Bay has, we have to recognize that Los Angeles, downtown Central proper, is a completely different place than the South Bay. If we were in Montana, we would be a different city, we would be a different funding area, we would be a different metropolitan planning organization. So we have to first break down our differences and then recognize the diversity in those communities. And I think maybe I'm going to answer that I think maybe part of our public participation doesn't work because just as we do blanket solutions, we do blanket public participation strategies. And we are very different communities. Los Angeles is many, many different places. And so I think that's what we're trying to bring to transportation funding. That's what we're trying to bring to the state. One size does not fit all. So that would be my reaction. We do have a question over here. A comment?
I thought he was asking us a question.
Oh, you want to answer? Okay.
It goes both ways, right? We can think.
Yeah, some community participation here.
Well, one method for public outreach that I've been involved in, either with state commission, decision makers at that level, or in local communities, I think walking audits are a good way to get the community out, and that can be a one-size-fit-all because as you're out there, it's in your community. And I think when you have decision makers and local people that are there, sometimes things that people are upset about in theory, once they see how it would look or implement or envision it there, that might dissipate, versus I think it also will kind of spark some new ideas and innovative plans for an area, and probably puts everybody kind of on the same playing field, that they're just humans. We all just want a livable neighborhood. So that's one suggestion I would have to your question.
Thank you. Good suggestion.
Not a town hall.
Not a town hall, right. Jim's got a question. Anybody else? Okay.
Well, just for a little feedback, as a former decision maker, I can tell you that the adaptive modeling is the right direction, because each community is unique, and as a decision maker, I know how does that data apply to my community and my neighborhood. So that's a good direction. Also, I mentioned if you have some way of collecting data on implemented policy. Wally mentioned this, what has been done? As a decision maker, if I can see a model over here of a city that's done X, Y, Z, what effect does it have? What benefits does it have? I have something to communicate back to my community.
Jim is always very good. Jessica, this is sort of the question. I mean, you and I have had many dialogues over the years, but what data do you have to support? I mean, this is exactly the faith-based planning business that I'm interested in. What data would you look at that says the South Bay is a good place for dedicated bus lanes? I would give you an entirely different argument. I would say that would inhibit the other strategies that we have data on, because you're taking away a roadway that, yeah, the idea here is the transition, the mode of transition. And if we could put our weight behind getting lots of small local used vehicles out there, the buses would take care of themselves, because the traffic would start walking and start moving to small vehicles. And so, I mean, I know you very well, and I know that's your, I know you very well, but I know that that's a policy that you really like, and for the good reasons. But does it fit here? I mean, there's no data that says it would fit here. That's what I think we're trying to go towards.
Well, I sometimes think we go back to, let's start with what kind of cities do we want to live in, what kind of communities do we want to live in, and I think for me personally, and I live in Echo Park, I do not live in the South Bay, I live in LA, for me, I would like to live in a community that has multiple transportation options. I heard that repeatedly today, and I totally agree on that. One of the things I love about transit is that anyone should be able to access and use it, from teenagers to people who let their kids who are 10 use it, to individuals with disabilities, to older adults, and it serves a huge swath of population when it works. Transit is only valuable to me when it's frequent and reliable. Wally, I don't want to get into a data fight. I would actually just challenge what kind of a community do we want to live in, and if we just want to switch the vehicles and not change behavior or change options for our vulnerable populations, I don't know if that's my... I just push back a little bit on that. I don't know. Does anyone in the audience have a different thought about that? Maybe some of our local cities might have a perspective.
Yeah, I'm actually more in agreement with Jessica than Wally on this one, and I work with Wally quite a bit. And it's because we started a program called Streets for All in Redondo, now it's in all 3 beach cities. And my idea behind that was it had to do more with safety in this perspective. In the sense that we can only fix so much infrastructure. We can only enforce so much, right, with our PDs. So we have to shift the mindset of how people use the roads, right? Whether they're speeding, running stop signs, whatever. And I think that very much applies to this as well. We have to, and it goes back to the community engagement aspect, we have to figure out how can you shift the mindset of the way people perceive this type of big change. Okay, and so I'm kind of in agreement with both of you, but the simple fact of the matter is, Wally, if PCH had rapid transit from the South Bay to Santa Monica, people would use it, but it's not there. It's not easy, it's not accessible, and I've said this to our metro representatives. They kind of draw a line at Rosecrans and say, we're not going to service the South Bay below Rosecrans. And that's why on one of your maps, you saw the transit centers where there was nothing in the beach cities, right? It was just on Hawthorne. So the way I look at it is if we don't figure out how to take all these big ideas and make them easy, much in the way that Uber and Lyft did, right? They made it so easy that anybody can do it anytime, and they don't have to think about it, then we can start to shift the broader community engagement as to getting people on board, and then they make those shifts. That's the thing. You have to get every individual to make the shift to whether it's walking a half a mile, because some people will just get in their car and drive the half mile because they're so used to it, because it's so convenient. And they want to know, oh, I can be back home in 3 minutes. So there's so much more to all these broad ideas, and I know we can get there, but I'm not quite sure how, because quite frankly, as an elected, I struggle with how do I communicate to my residents, and how do I engage them, because they're really busy people. So.
Well, in the spirit of this whole thing, I couldn't agree with you and Jessica more. I think that we should try to take PCH to the west side and get a, the COG should be a source of these innovations, and if we could collect these ideas, we'd be very happy to do that. I don't know that wouldn't work. I'm sort of skeptical, but I don't know that it wouldn't work, and I think it's certainly worth trying. And so, transit advocates, try this. When I was a kid, I'm going to look at a media metaphor now. When I was a kid, we had 3 TV stations, and we all gathered around the TV and we watched it, and that's why reading was really important, that you keep it on Channel 4 and watch Steve Allen or whatever it was on Sunday night. Today, we are in a world in which everyone carries in their pocket. They can get any information, any program, anytime they want it, any platform. It's complete 100% flexibility. And what I struggle with is how that culture fits with waiting for 15 minutes for a bus to come to sit amongst some other people. And Jessica, you said it lacks some dignity, and I know kind of what you're talking about. These are incompatible cultural moments that it's so consistent with what's in your pocket to just go where you're going, as opposed to waiting for some way to share a ride to get there. I mean, you would rather take Uber and share an Uber with somebody else. Having said that, I think it's a cultural conflict, but I also want to say, I agree with you. Let's do it. Let's see if we can't get money to do with this, what you guys are suggesting. We don't know. Let's try it. We're experimenters.
I think that what we're saying, once again, I'm saying one size fits all. What we're looking for is multiple options. If we had a network of slow-speed vehicles, people would be able to take their slow-speed vehicle to the regional system. So, it connects us to the region with a short local trip that's clean. So they all work together. The problem is we don't have options at this point.
One other observation is that I'm a critic of Metro because they're building so much light rail. And Marlon, you and I have talked about, and I'm throwing you in the soup or anything like that, but the term here is rapid transit. And light rail that goes on the surface is not very rapid. Dan, my favorite foil, took the Expo line from Robertson, from Culver City to Long Beach on a Sunday. It was 2 hours in each direction. That's not going to fly. No one's going to spend 4 hours on a round trip to Long Beach. You got to be building an underground so it can go really fast. And I don't. So this is a long debate. I understand that, but I think we should be looking at rapid transit. And I don't know that dedicated lanes do it. I don't know. We'll try.
We'll be asking our Hawthorne friends to get us Elon Musk for our next meeting. So, anybody on? Oh, Dan?
No, I mean, I've been in this space, not your space, but for 30 years, and we're all talking about this revolution of how we go. The Uber, Lyft, I heard it all day, and now I'm hearing, how do you get the communities involved? If we're revolutionizing how we're going to go, why are we not talking more about revolutionizing how we create this future? Why are we still talking about conventional models, conventional ways that Metro is supposed to work, and somehow the elected officials' burden to have a vision of this all and somehow get all their people, their constituents to understand this? How do we get bottom up? How do we get involved? How do we get people in the community to actually be part of creating this? It's co-design, and it's crowdsourcing. And it's using like the IDEO IDOU. It's like working with crowdsourcing, bringing people's ideas together, starting little mom and shop companies. But it's just not the way we've done it in the past.
Comments from the panel? Anybody?
No, I just love working in this field. Everybody's got an opinion. I think that working in transportation in Southern California, whenever I meet strangers or go to a cocktail party or something, and people ask me what I do, there's always a lot of robust discussion. And I think we all do have shared, outcomes, just different stuff. But again, I think that what concerns me, though, the most is, are we willing to change our own behaviors and then talk to our neighbors about it? Because I think one of the reasons Measure M and all of our sales tax do really good is because everybody hopes somebody else is going to get out of their car so they can go faster on the freeway. But I think if we want the Southern California we all want to be a part of and get to stay in, and I don't even think you have to be crazy and give up your car. But like right now, my quality of life, not owning a car, given Lyft, given Instacart, given all of the things I can do now is huge. And I save, I think, over $10,000 to $15,000 a year. Granted, I do not have children. I'm not caring for an older adult's needs. I'm not taking somebody to preschool, so there's all those complications. But I think it's an exciting field, but I'm a more back to basics person. I think the most innovative thing we could do in the city of Los Angeles is fix our sidewalks and crosswalks. I think the most innovative thing we could do is be more honest about people who are using transit are incredibly poor, and the reason they put up with the 2-hour trip on the Blue Line is they have no other choice. And so the difference of mobility options based on how much money you have is insane in this region, and I don't even know I didn't hear that come up today, and maybe that's because of the South, for a variety of reasons, but I think it's an exciting field. But where I'm more is, how do we support elected officials to be able to put in bike lanes and all the innovative stuff and not get booted out? Because that's what I'm hearing the most concern from leaders who I know who are in charge of this stuff is, what do I got to do to make this successful? And I think we need to have some more conversations around that. So.
And the South Bay, one of the things I always like to do is start with demographics. We're an aging community, and people are trying to age. Many people are aging in place. We're a place where people have come to raise their families. So it's once again looking at all those, answering all those different needs, and all those different needs cannot be answered with one answer. And that's what we're trying to state today, is that the programs that we're putting out are something that we can do to try to change the look so that it addresses more different kinds of people. And if I was single, I think I'd want to live in Echo Park too. if I raising children, I don't want to live in Echo Park. It's a different thing, and LA is fortunate enough to have space for everybody. It's a question of how they want to live in that way. Ellen?
Well, I think Jessica's not the only one that chooses not to have a car. There are other people, and people write about it, and it's an interesting experience, I'm sure, in LA when you do have kids. But there are people that do that, and by choice too. But this goes to the whole idea of the diversity that we have in the region, and maybe change. We live in a car culture as a city, as a society, and I think. I've talked about this a lot. I've been doing some work in London and talking about how we get out, because they look at LA as like the car capital of the world. How we get beyond that, and a lot of people have mentioned like smoking as an example. Smoking used to be like very cool, and now it's looked at as not a good thing for society, for individuals. And I'm not trying to say car. I don't want to make a moral choice, but like, how do we change the conversation that it's a great choice not to have a car or not to use a car all the time. And the London example is interesting because it was Margaret Thatcher who said a 30-year-old man who is on the bus could be considered a failure, because the idea of being on a bus, she had this idea that success means a car. And this is a worldwide phenomenon, because for a lot of the world that's rapidly urbanizing and getting more economic power, the goal is for people to buy a car, which is actually sort of the wrong direction our planet is facing. So we could set an example of it's cool not to have a car, it's great not to have a car, and there are other options. But to do that, we have to give people all those other options. And so it's sort of a chicken neck. It goes both ways.
So Wally mentioned the experimental pilot project we're working on.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any opinions on that? Are we missing anything in the arena we're trying to capture? Do you have any thoughts on that?
You're talking about the NEV pilot project?
Yeah, the exhibitions and right-ranging tools and all this.
I think it's great, and you need a lot of it. I've been to a lot of, I just went to, downtown LA just had a LA commotion they called it, and there was an exhibit of lots of mobility. Dan was there. I saw Dan. I don't know if you were there, Jessica, but I've been to a lot of electric bike, and it really makes me want to buy one because you get to try it. They set up a test track, but you need a lot of that to really engage enough people that you're going to sort of make a dent. And that's the other question. It's time and scale. How much adoption do you need in scale, and how long do you give yourself for it to actually make a difference in travel behavior?
Marlon, did you want to say
The pilot program sounds very thoughtful and very well designed. So first thought, I like it. And one thing to remember, a lot of what we're talking about here, urban planning should be pilot programs. This is the way we should think about it. Try things, evaluate them. If they work, wonderful. If they didn't, we learned something, still good. And I was really fascinated to hear how the discussion between Jessica and Wally, and I don't know your name, but how that turned around. And there was a place of agreement among people who obviously don't agree. And I would encourage us all to try to find those places. I mean, you know, could a dedicated bus lane be appropriate in the South Bay? And the answer to an agreement was something of the sort of, we could try it, we would evaluate it. If it works, great. That's what a pilot program is all about. And that might be part of the piece of how you begin to bring your publics along, is to say up front, we are trying this on this date. We will have this information. This will be the threshold for continuing. This will be the threshold for not. And then there's some fuzzy area. And then some communities will jump in and some won't. But I think the more we can think that we're all in a learning mode, the better off we'll be. And we're not trained to do that, right? We're trained to have our position. This must prevail. If not, then I lost. And that's not the world we're in anymore. So I really salute the whole COGS leadership in moving us forward.
Steve, are you standing for a reason?
I wasn't, but I could talk.
You want?
Briefly, Mike Bonin is doing a bus lane on Lincoln Boulevard in the Venice to Santa Monica stretch. So if there's interested in that kind of a pilot going further south, it would be an ideal time to link up with LA City.
Just in time. Rick, go ahead.
So, you know, in the old days they had one size fits all. And if you saw a shack in a bathrobe and then put me in the bathrobe, it would look really, really different. And I think it would be really obvious that one size does not fit all. And I think about the communities within the COG, and they're really different. And I'm thinking about your last slide, Wally, with the car upside down. And I think if a better tech rather than going after somebody else's, what is perceived as somebody else's goal, is just to make sure there's funding that really supports a different solution, a solution that's really more appropriate for your communities. And I think about this. I think about Carson and Englewood and Torrance, and then I think about the Palisades, and it's the Palisades. It's the terrain.
Palos Verdes,
yeah. Palos Verdes. I mean, just totally different. And you can't have one solution that fits all. And I think it's really important to have that acknowledgement, and then to get funding to really that doesn't put me in the same bathrobe that would fit Shaq.
Yeah, and I think I tried to make it at the very, very beginning this morning that, but Judy mentioned this, Calabasas, Gura, Santa Clarita. There's places we know just in our own area that don't look like the Wilshire Corridor. And we all need just many different options. And so that's what we're trying to address today. Buck, did you want to speak?
Oh, I don't know if I'm allowed to ask a question, but I'm going to anyways.
We're very egalitarian.
And thanks for getting rid of my pool hall, Wally. I'll figure something else out.
We'll bring it back.
Wonderful. In the neighborhood center, yeah? So it seemed like a big undercurrent, it seems like, when we're talking about policy, is either kind of policies that are giving people options and opportunity to change their behavior, and then there are policies that we're kind of dictating and trying to pressure them to change their behavior. And it seems like, again, in finding multiple solutions, as opposed to the one-size-fits-all, Shaq Rub analogy, which is awesome, by the way. I haven't heard that one before. There are some ways where technology seems to be tailoring itself to suit the way that we behave. Like Uber and Lyft, it's effectively substituting for having a car. But then there are also ways where we need to kind of give people the option, to potentially change behavior. Having, bus, dedicated lanes and, giving people these options. So this is generally obviously a very complicated thing. I've been working on this for months now and still having trouble, wrapping my head around all of it. And my question is, how do we, really walk that line between giving people the opportunity, which, I think it would be fair to say does lend itself, potentially, when taken to the extreme, kind of the faith-based, planning, and then also imposing people's values. Because when someone tries to change my behavior, my first reaction is to not do it. So how do we walk that line?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I think it's really tricky, and I think that's why public policy is so hard. The only thing, though, that one of the things that's on front of my mind is affordable housing right now. And in affordable housing in Southern California, we've done the carrot and not the stick. And at least in central part of Los Angeles County, we're experiencing the biggest housing crisis because we've chosen not to hold cities accountable that don't build housing. So I have no idea. I mean, I think in a perfect world, we have plenty of time to build consensus and have conversations, but I think at some point, I'm hopeful for leadership that says, this is the kind of community that we live in and everybody can get around and everybody can afford a house and we have great quality schools. Like, that's the vision I'm interested in, and I don't know, maybe you guys know, or you guys know, Jackie, Wally, I don't know, I think it's...
I mean, can I just say one thing that was interesting about working on the climate action plans, and with Aaron and Kim and the COG, there was a set of implementation strategies, and then each city got to pick the ones that worked for them. So it wasn't a one size. This is climate action plan. You're going to adopt it as it is. So they each were able to pick a set of strategies, and they was able to quantify the emission reductions, and I think that was interesting. And without drawing overall conclusions, I think you saw like the hill cities, adopted EV strategies pretty wholeheartedly because that sort of makes sense for them. The beach cities, active transportation seemed to be really adopted. And then more of the inland cities, it was transit oriented. So there was this idea that you can tailor a strategy and make reductions, but it's consistent with what works for your community. And that's a gross generalization I just made. It wasn't that simple. But I think it was interesting to see how they picked different, and in sort of ranges, different kind of options that they thought fit their city. So we talked about the idea of optionality and having different ways of looking at things. I think that's important. I can't get into land use things. That's really a hot topic. But in terms of climate action planning, the idea that the cities can actually tailor their plan, I think was somewhat effective.
Excellent. I wanted to address Jessica's question about the housing crisis. And I had our economists give me data on the South Bay. And over a 10-year period, there were 10 times as many jobs created than there were houses built. And so the issue here is it that there's not enough housing, or is it there are too many jobs? And so then that gets to the job apocalypse, which I wondered, is that going to take care of it, because no one will be working anymore. But leaving that aside, I would go to SCAG for all these years and I would say, why are we talking about prosperity without growth? Why do we have to have more jobs all the time? Who's actually benefiting from all these jobs? People move in here and then they want to buy up housing. I mean, the first thing I thought when the LA Rams came here was, oh great, now there's another 40 millionaires who are going to go live in Manhattan Beach. I'm not a big football guy, okay. But you know, that I'm saying there has to be a balance. We can't always be chasing the job chain, and that's what causes homelessness. At the end of that logic chain, too many jobs, not enough houses, someone gets bid out, and at the end of the line, then they're homeless. And so I don't know you can keep up with the job.
But I don't think you can keep people from moving from Southern California, Wally. I mean, I think people want to live here, people want to raise their families, they have their children need houses, and I think we can, I mean, population just continues to grow. And so when we have a jobs housing imbalance like we do, particularly on the west side, we have severe congestion because people who work there have a 20-mile commute home. And so I don't think it's realistic to think the jobs will go away and the people will go away and our housing, I mean.
I'll give you an example. San Mateo, didn't we hear? We were at a conference. Palo Alto, no, it doesn't matter. One of those up there has restricted the building permits on adding offices because they don't want to add jobs. It's easy.
Yeah, but that seems, I don't know if
that's... It's a philosophical discussion. We need to resolve it now. I'm just saying that no one thinks about, everyone wants to build more housing. I'm saying we should have less jobs.
Yep. Could I jump in on this? Was provocative, but maybe off topic. I'll let Jackie redirect.
No, okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I definitely. It's a whole other conference which I'd love to have with the mayor of Palo Alto that said that was enough. Enough is enough. I hope that if we imparted nothing more to you today, it's that we are an area that's diverse. We look like a lot of California. The answers that are coming are one answer, transit-oriented development. We don't say that there's anything wrong with transit-oriented development where it belongs, but it doesn't belong everywhere, and it doesn't belong in every community. And that's really the bottom line message. The second message, of course, is good data, that what we're still using, first of all, a lot of old methods to figure out what's going on. We need to update our tools because we need to look at things differently. We need to look at what's inside a building and what kinds of destinations instead of looking at just the footprint. Is the traditional zoning, the traditional TAZs, all these things you heard today, do they really work? And should we all be working together to find those new tools? And then, you know, at what level should councils of governments work with cities to address some of these strategies and figure out how to implement them and then how to evaluate them so that we really know, are we achieving what we're trying to achieve? We already know we're not achieving greenhouse gas emission reductions. How do we achieve that? And to bring us back to where we started today, this is a climate action planning forum. The goal of the climate action planning is greenhouse gas emissions. So in that narrow analysis, not considering anything else, we need a lot of work on greenhouse gas emissions, and that really was the direction of today, is how do we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. I want to once again say that the presentations are going to be on our website. There's a lot of handouts outside, which include papers, one-sheets, fact sheets that we've done on some of the issues that we've been discussing today. And then I want to thank Lark, who helped us put this on, the Los Angeles Regional Collaborative. And I want to thank the Southern California Edison, who sponsored the day and helped pay for the refreshments, and we really appreciate that. And then I want to thank the support of our board, Kurt Wiedemann, our chair, and our board members who really support these. Listening to this a lot, they've heard it and they've endorsed it, and we really appreciate it. They've endorsed it as a concept, you know what I mean? It's not like they're all running out in their cities and doing all of this, but it's something that we can all think about and work for and strive to see how we can implement in different ways. But the big thank you goes to the staff. This doesn't happen without the staff. And the one person that went unheralded today is Kim Fuentes, who's my Deputy Executive Director. We are now doing 15 climate action plans, and that means we're going to 15 cities, and we're working with 15 documents, and we're working with 15 staffs, and then we're working with 15 city councils. And I'm not doing that. Kim is doing that. So it's amazing that she's not standing. It's amazing. I don't know if she can stand. And as of last night, we have 5 cities that have already adopted their climate action plan. So we're really excited about that. We're going to be finishing that. And hopefully we'll have all 15 cities shortly with their own climate action plans. All right, now as whole separate efforts, well, helping her and also working on the sub-regional climate action plan has been Erin, who's also been going to all of these, Erin, Okay, Erin, Erin has been going to all all of these meetings, with sharing meetings with Kim, working on the document, but he also worked on today and has been working with Wally, and Aaron has just been incredible with making sure the substance and the logistics have been in place. The people that have made sure that all the PowerPoints look the way they look and say the way things they should say at Wally and Moshe's direction have been Buck and Aaron, who's got the microphone back there, Aaron over here, and Buck over here, and I want to thank them. Marilyn has been working on the PR. Natalie over there has been working on the logistics with our other wonderful person, David. There is nothing, I don't even want to introduce you to David, because there's nothing David can't do, and I don't want you to take him away from us. He's too great. So we absolutely love it. But we wouldn't be here today without Wally and Moshe, and the work that they've done, that they poured their heart out and over the last many years. And so I want to thank all of these people, and I want to thank all of you for being here today. And I want to invite you, I know you've had a lot of fun listening, you stayed, which is great. And so in the interest of thinking into the future, we are having our General Assembly on February 23rd. If you can take one of these brochures or take a bunch of them and bring them to your groups, this is on the evolution of retail. Because with all of these things going on, as Wally mentioned, retail is going to affect city land use, it's going to affect city finance. And we have an incredibly good program planned for you to talk about the evolution of retail and what it's going to mean to cities. It's a free event, again, just like today, sponsorship. If you want to sponsor it, we'd love that too. And it will be a really great day in the Carson Community Center. So I want to wish you all a very happy holiday. Thank you for coming, and thank you all to the staff. And I didn't thank our commentators again. Oh my God. Okay, thank you, commentators.
Good job.